Or just don't say that the communism has Polish roots, please.
Some Polish communists or historiographers of Marx and Providence tried to express such an opinion, but in fact it is of course not true.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Good day to all of you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation. Today we'll talk about philosophy. With me is Tomasz Herbich, Dr. Tomasz Herbich, the expert in Polish philosophy and counselor of the City of Warsaw. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So you are a professional philosopher, which I would say is a strange thing in the modern world. What does it actually mean, and how does your love to philosophy happen? Were you like this eager teenager reading Plato, or how?
Oh, I was an eager teenager reading Witold Gombrowicz and Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, and it was this kind of first contact with philosophy, which was through works, for example, of 20th century existentialists.
So you're an existentialist?
No, I do not think so that I was an existentialist, in fact, but I was really impressed by existentialism when I was a teenager. But after that, then I decided to study not philosophy, but theology and political sciences. And I even completed these two studies. But in fact, during studies, I realized that my approach to theology and to political sciences is of philosophical kind, that I'm more interested in, for example, political philosophy than political systems, or, for example, than analysis of current politics. And on this is, at the time, as a student of theology, I'm a reader of Nicholas Berdyaev and other different religious thinkers, Russian religious philosophers of the beginning of 20th century.
And then you became an expert in Polish philosophy, which is a tricky field, full of, I would say, also strange theories, messianism, very much connected to Romanticism. But not only, it is, I would say that a lot of even people at the faculty of Warsaw University are not fully expert in what happened in the Polish thought.
Yes, I think that you're right. And what is more, it is very important to say that Polish philosophical tradition is not well known also to us, also to Polish philosophers. And this is one of the main reasons why we should study this Polish philosophy. I think that when asking this question, why did it come about for me to get involved in studies on Polish philosophical thought, I should first of all start with one important thing. I think that we should decentralize our thinking of philosophy. What is important is the fact that original philosophy did not only develop in such countries, were not only developed in such countries like, for example, Great Britain, France, Germany, these major philosophical centers, but also original philosophy was developed in Poland in quite different historical times and it also in quite different historical circumstances. And I think that what is more, we can think of ourselves better through our philosophy than through that different philosophies of these philosophical major centers.
Okay, so who is your favorite Polish philosopher? Who is the thinker which you think made the great influence, the biggest influence?
You see, I was influenced first of all by Stanisław Brzozowski and August Cieszkowski, and these two philosophers were the first reason why I started to study Polish philosophy.
So we just put a point here because none of our viewers actually heard it. So you mean Cieszkowski and Brzozowski. As I remember, we come back to the times of modernism.
When we're speaking about Cieszkowski, we come back to the 19th century and to Polish Romanticism, but Polish late Romanticism, which is important. Cieszkowski was engaged in different in different disputes which took place in Hegelian school after the death of Hegel in 1831. His first important philosophical book was published in German in 1838, and he for the first time expressed in this book the idea of the philosophy of action. The philosophy of action which is going to overcome the contemplative character of Hegelian philosophy. Of course, this idea not directly but through Moses Hess inspired, for example, Karl Marx, but Cieszkowski in fact was not...
Or just don't say that the communism has Polish roots, please.
Some Polish communists or historiographers of Marxian Providence tried to express such an opinion, but in fact it is of course not true. Cieszkowski defined his political worldview as a conservative liberal. Yes, he was not, of course, a communist. He was directly anti-revolutionary. But in fact, of course, the historiographers of Marx and Providence also in Poland tried to directly connect Cieszkowski with Marx, of course, but in fact, it was just an idea expressed by Cieszkowski in that work, which later inspired also Karl Marx, but not directly from Cieszkowski, but through Moses Hess.
So there's this the philosophy of action, one thing, Cieszkowski and Brzozowski.
Brzozowski was a philosopher who developed this idea of the philosophy of action. He developed it into the philosophy of labor. He was also, of course, a reader of Marx because he lived in the and worked at the beginning of 20th century. But in fact, Brzozowski was such a philosopher who had many different fields of his philosophical interest. And he tried to construct such a vision of philosophy, which is going later to be formulated by such authors like, for example, Georgi Lukács. But of course, Brzozowski was not only an important Polish reader of Marx, but he was a very original Polish philosopher who left Marxism in some moment of his development of his thought, and who also was engaged in the development of this specific Polish current in philosophy, which we can call the philosophy of action.
Philosophy of action. This is common sense, and we're trying to gather people who also represent the common sense generation. That's so more practical reason, and definitely a virtue of British philosophy. Do we have a concept of common sense in Polish philosophy?
Yes, we have a concept of common sense. The most important historical example of this concept is for sure the work of Jan Śniadecki. Jan Śniadecki was a scientific researcher who lived in the turn of 18th and 19th centuries, and he was a representative of Polish Enlightenment. But he was such a representative of Polish Enlightenment who, first of all, was engaged in the polemic against Polish early Romantic culture. He was the most important antagonist of Polish early Romanticism on the one hand, and on the other hand, he was also such a representative of Polish Enlightenment who managed to take a critical position also on his own formation, also on this Polish Enlightenment, also on Enlightenment, and he directly expressed such an idea that in philosophy we cannot. It was of course against Kant first of all, and against other philosophers such as Descartes and such many other philosophers of modern times. He expressed such an idea that we cannot prove everything. We have to just accept some articles of rational faith, and these articles of rational faith are, for example, that external world exists. And we do not have to prove this. For example, there are many such articles, but for example, this article of rational faith that external world exists, and he directly took some inspiration over from Scottish philosophy of common sense. Yes, he tried to express such a point of view according to which our mind is exposed to different errors, is exposed to exaggeration, to one-sidedness, that in modern philosophy we can see different ways in which this exaggeration or one-sidedness was expressed in philosophy. For example, in Descartesian rationalism, or in such an empiricism which attributes everything to senses. And he tried to tell us that we have to accept these common articles of faith, of rational faith, which are common for us, and which make it possible to perceive the world in scientific way, and also to act in reality.
So the act of reality and the other connected to philosophy of action. It seems like both you mentioned in Polish philosophy, like those philosophers are actually calling for coming down to the ground, doing things, stop only romanticizing. But on the other hand, I think that the most alive of all the Polish philosophy is still Romanticism. It's still Mickiewicz, Słowacki, and of course Cieszkowski in a way, but more through literature and the messianism. Maybe because it's still alive in high schools and it is a fruit. Then it's sort of young minds start to read it, they engage in it, and even when they are against it, at least they get something out of it. But this element of messianism and this element of romantic philosophy is, out of all of them, the most immortal. Wouldn't you agree?
Probably it is the most immortal, but in fact we should think of Polish Romanticism in a different way, in which, for example, Carl Schmitt thought of political Romanticism in case of Germany. And we have to say one important thing, I guess. Polish Romanticism and also Polish Messianism are the ideas formulated in some historical circumstances. These are the historical circumstances of the nation whose state does not exist. And this is very important that first, and what is more, we should make it clear and we should realize that Polish Romanticism started with a kind of poetic escape from reality, started with this idea that we can escape from this reality into the world of poetic feelings, into the world of poetic images of our imagination. But, and it is in the case, for example, of Maurycy Mochnacki, one of the most influential representative of Polish Romantic culture, who was also involved in November Uprising in 1830 and in 1831. But it ends with something totally different. It ends with the philosophy of action, with a calling to action, with such a philosophy that treats this escape from reality, or with such a worldview which treats this escape from reality as something that cannot match the situation of Poland, the historical circumstances in which Poles have or had to live in 19th century. And this is why Polish Romanticism, of course, starts like different Romanticism in different other European countries, but it ends with something different. And also Mickiewicz, for example, ends with a call to action, with a philosophy of action, of course, and also...
and the action of taking part in a revolution in Greece.
Yes, of course. And for example, the upspring of nations in 1848 was something very important for Mickiewicz. And he died when he tried to form Polish army in Istanbul.
In Istanbul. So all formulated with this sort of feeling that the country doesn't exist, but the nation exists, and there is a huge threat of losing our identity to Russia, and to survive as a nation, as a language, and as a mind under this. In the shadow of a big empire. I would say this is something very alive still today for for a lot of people, for a lot of countries, and of course the most, our neighbor, who is, I would say, in a very similar situation than when Poland was 150 years ago or 200 years.
Yes. That's very important.
So this is actually to our modern viewers, to people who are looking at, listening to us and not having this East European perspective, but they know about the war in Ukraine, and they sort of can realize what a threat Russia was and still is to the neighboring countries.
Yes, and this is something that was directly expressed also by Polish philosophers and Polish different thinkers, yes? In Polish philosophy we can find two different currents in thinking about Russia, because we should also realize that thinking about Russia and Polish culture is also always thinking about Poland, and there are also different ways of defining what does Poland mean. And in this way we can find two different currents in this our approach to Russia. The first current, and probably the predominant current, can be connected with, for example, Zygmunt Krasiński, who was one of the very important poets of Polish Romanticism, but who also wrote some philosophical treatises. And the most important philosophical work of him is the work in which he dedicated the one chapter to this relation between Poland and Russia, and Poland and Moscow, in fact, because he named this second part of Slavic people, the Moscow, yes, and this Poland and Moscow represents in this vision two different principles. Poland represents the principle of freedom, yes, the principle of freedom, and Moscow represents the principle of slavery, which is of course of Asiatic, not of European kind. And what is important is the fact that Krasiński tried to look at the history of Slavic people as at the history of clashes between these two principles, the principle of freedom and the principle of slavery, which is of course represented by Moscow. And this is of course this first current according to which there is a direct clash between these two cultures, Polish and Russian cultures, yes, and between these also two approaches to reality, the one which tries to see our Slavs, our Slavic people as a part of European civilization, and the second one which tries to reject some basic assumptions for this also political culture of Europe. And the second current is quite different. It is the current represented, for example, by Andrzej Walicki in 20th century, or by Stanisław Brzozowski in some of his works, although Brzozowski looked at it in different ways, in different writings. But it is a point of view according to which there are some important common places for Poland and Russia, and according to which it is of course the point of view of maybe not of Polish society and Russian society, but of Polish and Russian intelligentsia, yes, of this specific social stratum or social class which is specific for Poland and for Russia. And yes, and they tried to somehow build some bridges between Poland and Russia by such a rereading of the intellectual history of Poland and of Russia, which tried to just make these two societies closer. So these are these two currents, yes. But for example, for us, of course, the most powerful current now is, of course, this first current connected with such authors like Zygmunt Krasiński or like Jakub Harzewski or like many others, who just tried to look at these relations between Poland and Russia as a constant clash between two different principles.
Two different principles and two different word view of the state as well. So I would say it connects very much with the category of common sense, the category of freedom, because without freedom you don't have a common sense. It is this element that I think it's also very rooted in Polish mentality, the fact that when a state brings certain rules, if those rules are against our reason, against our judgment, we are eager to break them. We are eager to not follow them, to try to not obey them and follow our own conscience, and in the same way our own common sense. It is something which happened to be very practical, especially just recently during the pandemic, when the state was proven not to know what to do. All of the states didn't really know what they're supposed to do, and they were imposing a lot of rules which, if they were followed very strictly, they would lead to death, lack of work, total isolation, and losing your health. Basically.
Yes, we can say that Poles are of Agambenian kind, yes, that we, probably, maybe not of all of us, maybe also not many of us, but there is something like that of which you are speaking, yes, this attitude towards reality, according to which we just have to act according to some vision of practical rationality, and we are not obeying state rules and state laws in any possible case. It is of course because of the fact, I think, that we also didn't have our state.
And it was the rules of different imperium, so either the Russian or the Germans or the Austrians. So of course then we realized that something might be not always in our interest, as the state is not working always in our interest. But it is a useful tool to have this a way of free thinking and value the value of freedom, which I don't think is an ultimate value, but it is an important command which creates space where we can put what we choose to put in, and not what a bigger authority puts in this void. And this is the part which I think consists also of the common sense.
Yes, of course it is. And when you define common sense in such a way, you can see Polish political tradition as something very important for the common sense tradition. And this is because of the fact that one can be expressed for 100%. It can be expressed that Polish political tradition is deeply permitted by this seek for freedom and seek for independence. We can think of the history of Polish modern philosophy, especially between 1795 and 1918, as the history which was defined by an attempt to construct own independent philosophical way of thinking about reality, which will just leave space for this practical rationality and freedom connected with this practical rationality, and which will not subordinate everything, for example, to such a vision of rationality which was directly expressed, for example, by Hegel, and which can be, of course, connected with state rules and state power, yes, and state laws.
Just to wrap up this episode, I do think that all of you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation, agree that common sense needs freedom. Without freedom, we cannot act freely, and very often we cannot think freely, and those two are connected. So seeking freedom to some extent as a tool, maybe not as a goal, is an important element, and this was proven also by Polish philosophers. We encourage you to read more about it, and I thank you for watching our show, and I thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.